And when we bring our young men and women home, when we begin a phased redeployment, I call for it to start on May 1st of this year, to have all combat troops out by law by March 31st of next year. When we begin to do that, then we are going to be in a position to actually create the kind of national security strategy that we need for the 21st century. A strategy that recognizes that not only do we have to be strong militarily, not only do we have to hunt down terrorists, not only do we have to finish the job in Afghanistan, but we also have to attend to the ungoverned spaces, the poverty and the strife and the violence that people around the globe experience each and every single day. That the roots of terrorism lie in the genocide in Darfur. That the roots of terrorism exist wherever people are being harassed by corrupt governments. That we have to project our ideals and our values around the world, not simply our military. That's how we are going to make ourselves more secure. It's time that we crafted that strategy for the 21st century. And when we begin to start bringing our troops home, think of the resources that we can start freeing up so that we can spend billions of dollars in rebuilding roads and bridges and hospitals and schools right here in America, so that we can start laying broadband lines through inner cities and rural America so that they can plug in to the internet economy, so that we can start investing in rebuilding New Orleans, that a year and a half after the fact still looks like a war has been fought. I remember when the president stood in that plaza and pledged that New Orleans would be back. And yet a year and a half later, if you travel through that area, you still are reminded of those scenes in which folks are on rooftops without water, without food, without shelter, where bodies are still floating in the water. You see buildings and neighborhoods and entire stretches that are completely abandoned. And it symbolizes that at some point during the course of the last 6 years, we've lost that essential sense of fellow feeling, that belief that regardless of what divides us, regardless of our differences in race and religion and political party, that there's more that binds us together than drives us apart. That we are all one people, that we are bound together, that we have mutual responsibilities towards each other, that I am my brother's keeper, that I am my sister's keeper. We've forgotten that, Austin. We've got to return to that spirit that built America. And we can do it because we've done it before. You know, I wrote a book recently called The Audacity of Hope. And in that book, I talk about the fact that I got the title from my speech at the Democratic National Committee, at the Democratic National Convention, but I have to confess in front of all of you, this is in the book, that I actually stole the line from my pastor. Because when I first moved to Chicago, I was a young organizer, about the age of a lot of the young people here, and I decided to work with a group of churches to try to rebuild steel plants that had closed and communities that had been devastated. Homes had been foreclosed, and commercial strips had gone into decline. And so these churches came together to see if we could set up job training programs for the unemployed and after-school programs for young people who had lost focus and didn't know what direction they were going in. And since I was working with a bunch of churches, I realized I should probably start going to church once in a while. So I walk into this church, Trinity United Church of Christ, and the pastor there is a guy named Jeremiah Wright. And Dr. Wright was delivering a sermon titled The Audacity of Hope. And his basic idea was very simple. What he said was this. He said, the easiest thing in the world is to be cynical. Nothing's easier than to say that the world is what it is. To watch the television and read the newspapers and see poverty and strife and violence and war, famine, and to say there's nothing we can do about it. That the best we can hope for is to protect ourselves and our families, to look after ourselves, to abandon the public life to those who are cynical, the special interests, the lobbyists, the people who will wield power only for their own benefit. What's hard, what's difficult, what's bold, what requires risk, what's audacious is to hope. It's to believe that the world as it is not the world as it has to be. That we can close the gap between those two worlds if we apply hard work and imagination and diligence, and if we work together. And I was inspired by that sermon, not only because I thought that it applied to my life, because it told me that you don't have to ignore the problems in the world to be hopeful. You simply have to be committed to bringing about change and doing everything you can to imagine a better world. But I was also inspired because I realized that that idea described the very essence of America. That America at every stage has always had the audacity to hope. You think about it, this is a nation that started with 13 ragtag colonies who decided at some point we're going to throw off the yoke of tyranny and defeat the most powerful nation in the world, the British Empire. And then not only did they decide to break off from the empire, they also decided to start an entirely new government of and by and for the people. Never been tried before. And there were a whole bunch of people who said the experiment in democracy could not survive. And yet it did. And then some people noticed that in the midst of this experiment, written into the very founding charter, we had violated the idea in the Declaration of Independence that all men had been created equal and that slavery was still staining this land. And there were those who said we couldn't do anything about slavery. But there were a bunch of abolitionists who said, yes, we can. And they agitated, and they organized, and they mobilized, and ultimately a war was fought, and blood was shed. And under Lincoln's leadership, the House was no longer divided between half slave and half free. And then there were a whole bunch of people who noticed that women didn't have the right to vote. That was the tradition. But I'm sure there was some woman one day who looked across the dinner table and said, she saw her husband and she said, I'm smarter than that guy. Why is it that he gets to vote and I don't get to vote? And so she started mobilizing her friends and her neighbors, and they started marching and writing petitions until they were full partners in the process of rebuilding America. And there were workers who looked around and said, we believe in free enterprise. We know that the business of America is business, but at some point workers should be able to share in the prosperity and the productivity of this nation. So some of them decided, well, we're not doing too well when we're divided. Why don't we get together and form a union? And together they all lifted up a middle class in this country and got wages and benefits and overtime and bathroom breaks that we now take for granted. And people said it couldn't be done, but some people said, yes, we can.